Well, hello, my friends. Another Astrological Voyages show, and today I'm having a great astrologer that I'm very happy that I met her, Jodie Forrest. We are going to have a great conversation about several things. We are going to talk about 2020. We're going to talk about solar arcs. We're going to talk about rectification. Jodie, thank you very much that you are with us today in the ISAR Facebook page.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So today we are going first to speak about 2020. And if someone has any question for Jodie, you can write it, you can type it, and I'm going to give her your question so you can easily ask whatever you want about the subject we're going to discuss. So if I wanted from you a summary first, a summary of 2020. What will be the basic keywords and the basic nature and psyche of this year?
Well, it's a year of changing directions. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a year of burning bridges, but it's definitely a year of several crossroads um, who are happening very close together in time. Three major conjunctions: Saturn Pluto, Jupiter Pluto, and Jupiter Saturn are really dominating the year. Astrology is really a study of cycles within cycles, and the relationship of two planets, their current cycle dates from the conjunction of those planets. Then as the faster one moves away from the slower one, we start that whole cycle involving those two planets. And it is unusual to have three of them occurring within the same year. For the US, it's unusually significant because we are in the orbs of our Pluto return. Since March of 2016, I use 10-degree orbs when I'm doing mundane astrology.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exact in 2022, but we are certainly already feeling it. And I think France's will be coming not far behind us.
Which chart you are using for United States?
The Sibley chart with Sagittarius rising.
Okay. And let's go first about United States and how this is going to affect United States. I'm not going to ask you who is going to win the elections and all of that stuff, but I'm going to ask you why is really important for United States 2020?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, soon to be joined by Jupiter, and there is a lineup in the late degrees of Capricorn, is well within the orbs of conjoining our natal Pluto, which is at 27 degrees Capricorn, 33 minutes in the Sibley chart. Mm-hmm. And the Saturn-Pluto conjunction is happening in the 23rd degree of Capricorn. So it isn't just the Pluto return energy of facing our shadow as a culture. The world is facing the shadow of Capricorn energy as Pluto moves through Capricorn. Mm-hmm. And since we were founded with Pluto in Capricorn, it's particularly significant for us. When Saturn gets into the mix, Saturn wants to make whatever it is touching real. It wants to make things concrete. It wants a real world response to whatever it is touching. In the personal chart, Saturn is where we build through effort over time. We face reality, we adapt to it practically. If we don't like reality, we work to change it in real time. From the aware self-directed self, from the waking ego, Saturn wants to manifest and control what it touches. Pluto is not controllable. Pluto is an outer planet. Pluto, I think, corresponds to the collective unconscious and specifically to the shadowy parts of it. In the individual chart, Pluto represents where you need to understand what you can, integrate what you can of your shadow material, mm-hmm. your blind spots, your psychological blind spots, your wounded side. On the astrology of mundane events, on the social level, Pluto refers more to a culture's shadow, a planet's shadow, cultural scapegoats. Pluto has the effect of tearing down and rebuilding what it touches. And on that level, Pluto can be felt as what's usually called acts of God, or the French term for that is force majeure, major force, major strength. Such as widespread fire, wildfires, global warming. These are quote unquote acts of God, and I suspect have something to do with what the planet needs to wake up to. In the US, I think we need to look very carefully at how materialistic this culture is. What Saturn and Pluto both have in common is power, is a desire for power and control in different ways. And trying to control the uncontrollable doesn't work very well, not for very long. I think we're seeing an awful lot of denial in this country about the shadow side of Capricorn that badly needs reforming. And I feel a little odd talking about defense mechanisms to a psychotherapist, Christos. But as I've learned about them a little bit, when I started doing readings, I felt that I needed to understand enough about psychology that I didn't do any harm. Denial is one of the first defense mechanisms, and it usually covers something pretty hot and pretty difficult. Human beings resist change the way animals resist change. We are going to have to go through an awful lot of change in this country and globally to deal with what lies in our very near future. And the first thing I think I'm seeing is denial. If we are to imagine Saturn trying to control things as a defensive, fearful reaction against perceived threats, reaction against what could go wrong, there can be a clinging onto the status quo with our fingernails. When what actually needs to happen is an acknowledgement that we are in a major transition in the US and in the world, and cooperating with the transition.
I think that you're very correct. I think even in my country, I live in Greece, I am part of the European Union, we are also have the same problems. We are in denial of understanding the financial situation, that we cannot live as we lived in before. And I think there is a lack of understanding. And I'm sure that you have also in United States people that even they are denying the existence of global warming, that everything is something like a made up history. And I think this is going to bring a lot of conflict even further. But so United States is in this situation, and you are going to face that in the future. And I think the major problem is that if it's going United States to sustain the level of life for the people and also be the first world power in the next decade, do you believe that United States can sustain this level for its citizens, but also to be the global power, the first global power?
That is a very good question. And I think we are all looking at that right now on some level. The Romans occupied Britain for something like 450 years. Europeans got to this country, 500, 600 years ago, got to this continent 500 or 600 years ago. I'm not sure what the lifespan of a culture is, or the lifespan of an era, but I think we are certainly looking at a major shift in ours. And I hope that we will continue to be able to be a world power, and that will involve a lot more cooperation, acknowledgement, good reality testing, which is a Saturn virtue, and cooperation with the rest of the world if we hope to maintain whatever position we've had up to now. And go ahead.
When some people, you know, there are people that they don't like sometimes for you to be a superpower, but when I always answer to them, imagine who will be the next one. So we may be happy with the current one. So sometimes we may have the scenario be worsened and not getting better. So sometimes the problem is not about United States. You know, you are sometimes the ones that the whole world says you are the problem.
You bet.
Yeah. Also, I don't think that always is the true. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Tell me.
The last time that the Pluto-Saturn conjunction happened in Capricorn was 1518 to 1519, which corresponds with the Europeans arriving in America and Cortez's invasion and conquest of Mexico. And I really don't see us invading and conquering another country, but we have, I think the roots of the current conjunction in Capricorn go back to that last one. The idea that it's okay to live in a very hierarchical society, that there are haves and have-nots, that there are the extremely powerful and the totally powerless, that governments have the right to do whatever they please, that corporations have the right to do whatever they please. The psychologist James Hillman said something very interesting years ago, that it's impossible to understand the 20th century, and I think the 21st, without the realization that multinational corporations are power players, a bit like Italian city-states were in the Renaissance. They're like countries without land other than the offices they own. And they're like countries without borders. And because they control a great deal of money, they have a great deal of power.
Do you believe in the long term that is not going to have, we are going to have an ending of what we call nation state or nation country situation, that this kind of multicultural financial interests of great business is going to affect even the core idea of having a nation in an independent state in the future?
That's a very good question. I really don't know. And I think if there's a breakdown of nation states, it's more likely to happen when Pluto has moved into Aquarius. It's sort of, we are looking at the Capricorn handwriting on the wall right now. And as Pluto moves into Aquarius, I have a feeling things are more likely to shift politically. I don't know what's going to happen to the idea of nation states. The corporations are living on the same planet we are, and they will be facing the same climate crisis and the same problems. It would be nice to think that they're willing at least to help with some of the adaptations we need to make, if not lead the way. We are currently having bowed out of even admitting that it's happening because we're not signing the Paris Accords.
Yeah.
So civilizations do fall and reform, certainly under Pluto-Saturn, but it may be in a way that we don't foresee right now. In some ways, it's hard to analyze the astrology of your current time because you are bathing in it. It is surrounding you. It's like asking a fish what water is.
Yeah.
And I can make what I hope are some educated guesses, but the bottom line is, I don't know. They are guesses.
So according to the most of astrologers I've heard, Saturn Pluto is always interpreted like being a severe crisis in the world. So I would like to hear your opinion about what is the long-term effects of this cycle, how people, states, the world is going to be affected by this specific conjunction.
Well, the conjunction happens about every 32 to 37 years. I think depending on where, especially Pluto is in its orbit. And the one before the one we are dealing with now was 1982, 1983 in Libra. There was a recession. This country decided to usher in Reaganomics instead of economics. And the gap, at least here, between the have and the have-nots, that is now really scary, started to widen I think, around the time of that conjunction. Before then, the conjunction happened in Leo. And Europe was still dealing with post-war recovery.
Mm-hmm.
And those were very difficult times in Europe. In this country, the National Security Act was passed in 1947. So we had the birth of some of the intelligence community here. And I think Israel's charter dates, Israel as a nation dates to 1947.
Oh,
That conjunction was in Leo.
that's great. Yeah.
Before then, it was in Cancer, 1914 to 1915, and had a great deal to do with World War II.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, World War I. What's the matter with me?
I think they understood. So in the long term, you may believe that we may have some problems in specific ways, perhaps in how society works. I think Barbara was talking about the rise of inequality within the systems and within societies.
I hope some of that will be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I sincerely hope so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Europe in the 15th century, the early 16th century, had a lot of affluence suddenly appearing, but it was because they were robbing the Americas,
Mm-hmm.
largely.
Yeah.
Europe was the major power of the day. And with what country was in charge of the major power of the day shifting. I'm not sure it led to much income equality.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And at the same time, you already said that at the beginning of the show, that 2020 is a great year because we're having two more conjunctions, and we have this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction also, which is happens even more often, but it is another conjunction within just a year. So combining this Saturn and Pluto and this Jupiter and Pluto conjunction, what we may have as a result?
Jupiter exaggerates what it touches. Jupiter expands what it touches. Personally, Jupiter has to do with where we find hope and optimism, what makes life worth living for us, what makes us think everything could be for the best and the best of all possible worlds. Jupiter on a societal level, I think, is where the culture is dealing with a somewhat exaggerated form of that sign, where the culture should be behaving inclusively and benevolently, but sometimes will flip into the other side of Jupiter, which is being a true believer in something, being dogmatic. It rules organized religion, philosophy, higher education, explorers, internationalism, and quests, inter and outer quests. Its excesses have to do with a craving for luxury, self-indulgence. Nothing is ever big enough. Nothing is ever grand enough. And another downside of Jupiter is a person who has a guru complex, a messiah complex. So as it comes into the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, I could see, I would like to see a charismatic, realistic voice, several of them, start speaking up and really pointing out the inequities of the world that are driving a lot of the problems. The Dalai Lama is right. Greed is the source of a tremendous number of problems of the world today. And I would agree with that. So it would be nice if several Gandhi-like figures appeared on a global level. I'm not expecting it, but it's Jupiter, one can hope.
We can hope, yeah.
Yeah, we can hope.
We can hope.
So governments may get involved, lawmakers may get involved. Professors may get involved. I'd love to see sort of a major wake-up call that the planet responds to. On the other hand, it may exaggerate the Saturn entrenchment, attempts to entrench the current social structure.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be hard to know which way it's going to go. Simply Jupiter conjunct Pluto occurs every 13 years. 13 is a lunar number to me. There are 13 lunar months in one solar year. And I've always felt that Pluto has a feminine side, that Pluto is sort of like the strong, reforming Kali side of the goddess, and sees what needs tearing down and rebuilding. Now, the exact conjunction happens in April 4th.
Mm-hmm.
And very close to then, Mars will conjunct Saturn in Aquarius and square Uranus in Taurus.
Mm-hmm. And while we have all that, at the end of the year, we have this conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, which is not just a conjunction in the 0 degrees of Aquarius. It is the beginning of a new cycle in the Aries signs between those great planets that in the old years was the current planetary clock for the medieval or the ancient astrologers. They didn't have Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. And having this final conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in the Aries signs for the next 200 years, how this is going to end up finally, how it's going to work.
The shift of the element from earth to air. Well, I think that Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions have to do with a shift of generations every 20 years, a shift of an era every 20 years, the opening of we hope, a new social order.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel a little strange talking about Greek mythology to a Greek man as well. But to my understanding, it was Jupiter who overthrew Kronos or Saturn in that mythology. And if this is related to our overthrowing, stopping, putting limits on the excesses of Capricorn, the excesses of Earth, the excesses of materialism, this will be a very, very good thing. I also have a feeling that Jupiter's quality of sort of bringing a new vision, when Jupiter's busy in your chart, you're almost downloading a new vision. You can get inklings, intuitions about what the future might be like for you, or what you might wish to have in your future. New ideas, new inventions frequently happen with Jupiter moving through a sign. And in that respect, as it shifts elements, and the kickoff is in Aquarius, I hope there will be a realization that we need to act in the common good. And if the driving force of the culture for the last couple hundred years has been quite material, 200 years ago, a little over 200 years ago, was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the world has changed almost unimaginably since then. It would be good to think that the conjunction happening in air may help us realize we need to use our brains to work through this. We need to think logically and sensibly and intelligently at the facts of our common plight, of our common situation, and use our heads. Not our solar plexus.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sophia, one of the people that sees the show right now, watches the show, says that it may symbolizes the birth of a king or someone who will be of high status.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Although in Aquarius, we're usually, because it's the opposite sign of Leo, we may probably expect the end of the monarchy, not the beginning of that, except if it's the beginning of the autocracy, because it's the other part of Aquarius. Sometimes.
Well, Aquarius likes reforms, and sometimes Aquarius lacks a considerable amount of emotional intelligence about the human cost of those reforms that it is so fond of. And we certainly need to make progress. And I hope we don't embody it at a human cost that is too high. And we're starting off 200 years of the mental element, the thinking function, the rational function, the intellectual curiosity of air. It's as if that will be in charge. That's the sort of Jupiter-Saturn dynasty that's being founded, is an air dynasty, if you like. So if there's a new zeitgeist, and I suspect we're in the middle of a zeitgeist change, I think Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions tend to usher in shifts in the zeitgeist. It's kind of like the midwife of a shift in the zeitgeist.
It's very interesting, yeah. Didn't think about it. Yeah, that's a very good way of thinking, yeah. So, at the end of 2020, let's give an appointment, okay, in Astrological Voyages. And let's say we are going to talk in January 2021. What do you believe that is going to be changed the most?
I hope it's our reaction to the environmental crisis that will be changed the most. And I really don't know. I am hoping there will be considerable economic reform and the recognition that it's economic crises that are driving a lot of the have-nots of the world. And
do you believe that something like a new upcoming crisis may come again and hit, for example, the American market?
The stock market could be in trouble, and the global market could be in trouble.
Well, when the United States is in trouble, we all are in trouble in that that thing.
Well, there are some safeguards in place against the kind of depression that we had in 1929. There are some. I'm not sure there are enough. The last Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in 2007 was sort of the height of the bubble and the burst of the bubble, the economic bubble, at least here in the US. And since Pluto tends to rule other people's money, and it rules riches, and I think it is pretty involved in stock market cycles and economic cycles, we could see a major shift. There is opportunity anytime the zeitgeist is changing. And if energy companies got behind finding new and better and cleaner sources of energy, that is really what I would love to see happening. And it's to their benefit. They don't lose their shirts. They don't lose their business. They're building public will. They look like good guys. They have the money and the capability to do this. I think it's recognizing the need and moving forward.
Indeed. When I was looking at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 2020, I think I seen the Saturn-Pluto conjunction being on the midheaven IC right upon New York. And the heart of the United States, I think, is New York, is not Washington. Washington is just an administrative level. So yes, I think this is going to be about you, mostly about what happens with the system and how you control or you're not control corruption and all of that. But I think, yes, the most important is that the people to deal with environmental pollution and all of that problem, that it is almost a huge problem. At least in Athens, it is mid-November, and I'm still with very, very short clothes, and it's like being spring. I don't know what happens in the United States, but in Athens, we're having the warmest November ever.
We are having our warmest November ever, too. Every year is getting rated the hottest year on record. And I live in Southern California, and we're sort of on a permanent fire watch the last 3 months of the year.
You have this fire, yeah. Yeah.
I'm visiting my sisters in the Pacific Northwest as I speak, and it's a very different climate here, and they're still having the warmest November they've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the Saturn-Pluto conjunction chart, which I ran for DC,
Mm-hmm.
and it's an 11th house sun. The conjunction is happening in the 11th house, the house of the future, the house of committees, the house of goals, the house of, among other things, political parties, groups in general. It has a 6th house Leo moon, and it has Pisces rising with Neptune on the ascendant.
Mm-hmm.
And Mars is applying to a square of the ascendant and of the Neptune. So I imagine there will be some confusion about exactly what is happening. And it may be that the two-party system in the US expands to include many other parties, as is the case in Europe. I also noticed that the moon's last aspect after the conjunction before it goes void, I think it's important to look at those, is in opposition to Venus.
Mm-hmm.
And that would suggest financial, economic consequences, lack of funding for the arts. And since oppositions also refer to something that needs working out, something that needs adjusting. I suspect that the Equal Rights Amendment and abortion rights will be the threat that is currently facing those things will be removed.
Mm-hmm.
The moon rules women. Venus is a feminine planet.
Yes. Yes, it will be difficult. Also, this year has a lot of eclipses. We are starting from 10th of January, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eclipses. And personally, I include even the eclipse of the end of December 26. So there are even more. So which eclipses you believe are the most important, where we should keep an eye on what happens, or which eclipses are very good and they may help us develop and deal with things?
Eclipses are very powerful, very powerful. Trump's current problem started around the eclipse and the full moon of last July. I think that the most powerful eclipse and the one that we should pay the most attention to is the one that happens on January 10th. That has the moon in 20 Cancer opposing Saturn and Pluto in 20 Capricorn. And it's very close to a Uranus station at 3 Taurus.
Yes.
And the Sun and Mercury are both involved with the conjunction. The moon's last aspect before it goes void, of course, right after the eclipse, is in opposition to Pluto. So since this is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction year, and the actual conjunction happens once in 2020, I would think that this eclipse inaugurates it, goes hand in hand with it, and will make whatever the eclipse is about for us harder and harder to deny, harder and harder to ignore. The moon is the public, women, the common people, day-to-day activities, nurturing, food, water, shelter, the limbic system, and I think the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, clothing, shelter, and I would add health to that. Health, physical safety, part of shelter.
Yes.
And I think as Uranus moves through Taurus, we are all needing to look at the messages that the Earth is sending us. The climate crisis, one way of looking at this imaginatively with everything that's happening on the planet, the Earth is in revolt. Mother Nature is sending us a lot of information. Mother Nature is behaving in a way that we can't ignore. And much as Saturn would like to control nature, nature isn't very controllable either.
Yes, that's I think really true. We need to hear Earth. We need to hear our nature, and also and we're going to talk about 2020. We have a lot of retrogradations, not about Jupiter, Pluto, etc., but we have Venus being retrograde, we have Mars being retrograde, and I want you to give me some insight about this Mercury being retrograde in the water signs, what all of this retrogradation of the personal planets and of this watery retrogradation of Mercury means.
First, if we just look at the element water, Mercury in water, it's not so much that it operates emotionally as in feelings. It's more that it wants to operate based on what it thinks is right. It goes through a judging process, but the basis of the judging process isn't practicality, and it isn't the intellect. It's doing the right thing. And we can certainly disagree on what the right thing is. I think Mercury being retrograde in water is a time when we need to listen to our emotional selves, to our feeling function, more than usual. I have a feeling that people are going to need an extra amount of time to just sit and process, emotionally and otherwise. Water is, in some ways, it's hard to say what's the more powerful of the elements, but water is persistent. And water has an awful lot of staying power. The retrogradation in water, anything that you can put the prefix re in front of in English tends to work with Mercury retrograde. Revising, re-editing, recalculating, rethinking, refeeling also. I think those retrogradations will be excellent times for people to spend as much time as they possibly can feeling their way through their current situation and doing a lot of thinking about, what do I feel is the right thing to do here? What's the next right thing that I could do? Is sort of the big question for Mercury retrograde. Yeah. I also like to think of the retrogradations of Mercury as a time when your non-dominant hemisphere is asked to do some work. In very general terms, people tend to be left-brained or right-brained. They tend to have a preference for using the left hemisphere's analytical, logical, math-oriented, thinking-oriented side, or using the right hemisphere's creative, global processing, imaginative, understanding things through images and symbols more than through words. If you primarily use one hemisphere more than the other, I think under Mercury retrograde, things happen in your life that ask you to use the other side. Since Mercury rules the brain and it rules thinking, it's as if we need to go into the hemisphere less traveled, the hemisphere less inhabited. And everybody uses both sides of the brain unless it's been cut down the middle surgically. Exactly. And we need to do some consultations with the brain that we don't usually use, with the activities of that hemisphere. Say the mathematician is faced with a relationship that she cannot walk away from, that she cannot rationalize this out of existence. It's there, it's a feeling, she has to deal with it. Or the artist, very right brain, very creative, night owl kind of artist, suddenly has to do his own taxes. Suddenly has to compute and figure out his own taxes. So it's as if we all deal with the opposite side of the brain a little bit more. We need some practice in the opposite side of the brain, as well as revising and rethinking and re-editing and reviewing.
And what about the Venus being retrograde? It's going to be retrograde in Gemini. And a few months later, we are going to have again a retrogradation of Mars, which are both planets that they do not go retrograde very every year. It's more rare, the retrogradation, but it still happens within a year, even that.
Well, the Venus retrogradation in the course of its trajectory is going to be squaring Neptune. And I think when Neptune gets involved, when the Neptune in Pisces gets triggered, that is probably what we will be looking at on a global level. On a personal level, when Venus is retrograde, we tend to revisit and rethink and refeel our relationships. It can be a time of taking stock, of working things out, or of doing a lot of thinking about how to work things out before we commence that process for real. How we deal with our fellow human beings is Venus too. And Neptune is in Pisces. Where Neptune is socially, I think has to do with where is the current call toward consciousness, toward perceiving ourselves as something more than the body and the ego and the personality and the driver's license. What's the current avenue toward some form of altered states of consciousness, or some acknowledgement of mystical realities or transpersonal realities? Neptune was discovered in the middle of the 19th century, and there was a lot of social revolution happening at the time Neptune was discovered. Child labor laws were enacted, laws against child labor. Journalists, they were called muck-raking journalists because they were raking up a lot of muck or mud about how business people were behaving and inequities in society. I think that some of our social working organizations and women who have become rather synonymous with social work started doing some of their work around them. So that in some ways has a lot to do with the social meaning of Pisces, of Neptune, as well as fads, fashion, chemicals, gas, oil, drugs, whatever we dissolve ourselves into, distract ourselves with, drug ourselves with. I put a cartoon up on Facebook a couple months ago, and there were a couple of people, and obviously dead and decaying, walking along with their cell phones on down a street. And the caption was, "Beware of cell phone zombies." So what we are addicted to, what we distract ourselves with, what we do instead of facing things, is also ruled by Neptune. It was last in Pisces 1847 through 1862, and that corresponds to the gold rush in California and Alaska. And pre and early Civil War and Industrial Revolution social consciousness. There was a big anti-slavery movement in this country long before the Civil War. It's interesting to me that the movie Harriet has just come out about Harriet Tubman, who saved a great many slaves who went north on the Underground Railroad. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So I'd love to see a rise in social consciousness. And when Venus is retrograde, we may be taking stock of what social consciousness we need to raise, how much inequity in society is addressable, what are our quote unquote gods, what are our drugs. Some reassessment there may be necessary. It may not be the best period of time for diplomacy in the world.
No.
Simply because Venus is retrograde.
And when Mars is going retrograde?
Well, Mars is going retrograde in its own sign, Aries. And early in the retrogradation, it will be squaring Pluto and squaring Saturn. Now, the inner planets are like catalysts. They kick off, they light a match, they are the long fuse that finally reaches what will burn. Inner planets tend to trigger larger outer planet events.
Mm-hmm.
Inner planets in your birth chart will trigger longer lasting transits or progressions. And I imagine this will be a time when, however we are responding to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, comes much more into focus, possibly in an angry way. We may see more demonstrations, not just in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
We may possibly see some more armed conflicts break out. There are usually several going on in the world at any given time. We may see more of those. I am not totally up on what countries I think Aries rules. Germany comes to mind. Mm-hmm. But on the global scheme, countries that seem to have an affinity with the planet Mars may be experiencing an extra amount of stress. And a need for assertiveness, a need for boundaries, a need to stand up for themselves, or a need to address how they deal with unrest.
Yeah. And I think that we already talked a lot about 2020. I think you gave us great insights. I would like also to speak about some other stuff. First of all, I've learned that you write a new book about solar arcs. And first of all, do we know the date or the time and from whom, who is going to publish you?
Well, I'd like to get the final draft done by March of 2020. That is my goal. And I suspect I will be self-publishing and publishing in Kindle form, in e-reader form, and print-on-demand form, at least at first. I would love to have an astrological publisher pick it up, but I suspect one of the best ways to do that is to bring it out myself first.
I think that it is the new and the basic way from now on. I've talked with many astrologers that write book in United States at least, and they are all going self-published. So that's something tell us. But okay, let's talk about the solar arcs. And I think that solar arcs are used mostly in the last 20, 25 years. I don't think that before that we were talking about solar arcs. So it's something that for many people is new, although it's not. And my basic question is, why summon to use solar arcs? Is it very successful? Is it something that we can do our work, or is something that it is something more generic?
Well, another dangerous psychological comment when I'm talking to a psychologist. I think part of the process of healing, flourishing, being the person we were meant to be, having a fulfilled, active, thriving life, isn't just looking at and working with one's wounded side. It's also supporting and feeding one's sane side. Mm-hmm. And keeping track of your solar arcs is one of the best ways to figure out how to feed your healthy, normal, flourishing, not overdone human ego. How to strengthen your sane side. The stronger your sane side becomes, the less likely your wounded side is to grab the steering wheel of your life and take over. Mm-hmm. And you can look at the development of the human ego, the sun, simply by tracing somebody's solar arcs throughout their lifetime. It's an immediate way to figure out what you need to do right now to get an extra dose of sanity. Where might your sanity be being challenged? Where might you be tempted to let your hurt side run the show? And what do you need to do to feed your sane side? Mm-hmm. I also want to add here that our wounds, our hurt side, what's happened to us, it's always with us. Negative voices in our head that date from childhood, whatever you want to call it. You cannot amputate them from your brain, but you can learn to deal with them very differently. You don't let them take over your behavior, and you don't yell at them. You feed your sane side, and you are compassionate with your wounded side. You're gentle with it. And the stronger your sane side is, I think the easier it is to do that. Mm-hmm. If something happens that upsets you, and you react immediately, reflexively, without thinking, that may come from your moon, and it may come more from your wounded side than from your sane side. But if you can give yourself, a few seconds delay before you react, your sane side has a chance to jump in and say, well, I sure heard that a lot when I was a kid, but this person is not my dad, and that is not what is happening now. And you can respond a lot more calmly, considerably more calmly. Feeding your sane side is what creates that temporary lull, that space between action and your reaction. It makes it wider and wider. So those are very good reasons to look at your solar arcs. Also, the sun is the active principle of consciousness, and solar arcs, I think, are a little bit like Saturn events. It's a good idea to craft an event in the outside world around your solar arc. And if it's just a ritual that you do all by yourself, it's a good idea to do something under solar arcs, to enact them, to embody them in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. And typically there's a lot of activity in our lives when our solar arcs are being extremely busy. A year when we have a lot of solar arcs happening tends to be a pivotal year. They're based on the sun. They're calculated by moving all the planets ahead the same number of degrees that the secondary progressed sun has moved. So they're easy to calculate, very easy. They move roughly a degree a year, sometimes more quickly, sometimes more slowly. But you can guesstimate your solar arcs by just looking at your chart and doing them in your head if you like, or you can do that with your friend's chart. They're immediately accessible. And that's another virtue of them.
Would you agree, because I heard that once from an astrologer, that solar arcs is about mundane events and events with what to do with our ego and ourselves, while, for example, progressions is about more information about various things in your life?
No, I think I would not agree with that. I think that any solar arc that you experience always refers back to your sun. The progressions of Mercury are about the development of your Mercury, your evolving Mercury. Solar arcs represent events that you can use to become more sane and more conscious and more together and more stable and more happy and more fulfilled. Even if the sun isn't directly involved with the solar arc, they always refer to the development of the sun. So they're a unique technique in that they always refer back to the sun. Obviously, the planets involved in the solar arc they have something to do with it too, but it's as if the root symbol is the sun. And using a solar arc to feed your sun is always, always possible. If you have a Venus-Jupiter solar arc, the question is, how can I use this Venus-Jupiter solar arc, certainly to help those planets, but how can it make me saner if I work well with this Venus-Jupiter solar arc?
And there is always a debate in Greece, I don't know if it is the same debate in United States, about using only the Ebertin aspects, the eighth harmonic, or using also trines and sextiles and other kind of aspects. Do you use also other aspects other than eighth harmonic, or just the eighth harmonic in solar arcs?
Well, I like to use the Ptolemaic aspects in my work with clients. And when the sun is involved, anything the sun does is extremely important because it's the battery that powers up the rest of the chart. So I like to talk about all the solar arcs when I'm doing a reading for a client. All the ones that are having Ptolemaic aspects at the moment. Sometimes I will look at a quincunx, especially if a solar arc is creating a temporary yod in somebody's chart. But I use 90% of the time, 95% of the time, I just use the Ptolemaic aspects.
What made you to concentrate and write a book about solar arcs? Why solar arcs?
Because that's the technique that my students have asked me the most questions about over the years. It seems to be the thing they had the most trouble understanding. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the difference and trying to work out the difference and trying to understand the difference myself. And then one day in the middle of washing the dishes or doing something completely unrelated to astrology, the notion that they refer back to the sun and they are sanity producing or sanity lessening just popped into my head. So I sat down and looked at them and thought about them and looked at lots of famous people's charts and looked at my own chart. And of course, there are going to be other interpretations for them, but I think I've come up with one that seems valid to me and my clients and my students.
Talking about students, I've seen that you're also preparing a 6-week course about talking about rectification basics, and you're going to you're going to speak in that in the IAA, in the International Academy of Astrology.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of people, my personal point of view is that if you don't know rectification, there is always a problem being an astrologer. This is my personal point of view. So you need to know rectification. So in your own work, do you believe that the most of the people right now in astrology in the United States, that where you live, know about rectification? There is a problem how they're dealing with rectification. What is your opinion?
Well, I get a lot of referrals from astrologers and therapists for rectifications. I enjoy the work and I do a lot of it. Frequently, when other astrologers find out that I rectify charts, they say, oh, good, I'm glad to be able to find someone I can refer to because I don't want to do it. It takes too much time. I'm just not sure I'll get the right time. My client load is such that I just can't devote the time and energy it takes. And I'm very happy when people send me rectifications because they're fun for me. It's like a great big astrology crossword puzzle.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah, happening in time and space.
Yeah.
And using 3 different techniques to sort of, I'm triangulating with 3 different techniques.
The most basic thing of all you need for rectification is of course patience. But for all of these people that they want to try and do rectification, and sometimes they are fear of it, what would be your own, let's say, personal opinion? How you would tell them something to help them? Your advice?
It isn't hard. It just has a lot of details, and you need to be patient. And if you go about it systematically, using several different techniques instead of just 1 or 2, and if you have a list of at least 2 dozen, preferably 3 dozen, really important events in the life of the client, remembered as accurately as the client can place them, then you have an excellent chance of coming up with a fairly accurate birth time.
This rectification training is for rookies or for people that already know some basics?
Well, it would be good if a student knew natal astrology and understood the theory of transits, the theory of secondary progressions, and the theory of solar arcs. So not the sort of beginner who only has studied natal astrology, somebody who has at least a nodding acquaintance with dynamic event prediction.
Doing rectifications, do you believe that the most of the people in America know their correct dates, or the most of them it's like having something very generic and they do not have a precise time? How in United States things work? What are they doing in the hospitals?
Well, since 1968, legally, your birth time should be recorded on your birth certificate. Some doctors or hospitals are a little slack about that. They may look at their watch half an hour after a difficult birth and say, oh, it was 10 minutes ago. So the birth time on your birth certificate may not be accurate, but it is a legal requirement now since 1968 that your birth time is written on your birth certificate. Before then, that was not the case. And there were a couple states, Illinois and Indiana, who took a long time deciding what time zone would be in effect in what part of their state.
Mm-hmm.
So proportionately, I probably do more rectifications for people born there than in other states, just because of the time zone question. Was it CST? Was it CDT? Was it Central Standard Time, or was daylight time in effect?
Oh, you have this kind of problem too.
Yeah.
Greece is just having one time, so we don't have that problem.
Oh, you're lucky.
So it's a little bit easier here.
The advent of computers has helped considerably. Time zone atlases are now programmed into computers, but there's still enough haziness about what time zone was in effect in those two states that the question comes up a lot.
Well, it was a great conversation. I really wanted to thank you having with me for this whole hour. I think your insights are going to be here to people, and perhaps some people may ask you some things after the end of the show, so you should even try to keep up, because some people may want to ask you. And if someone wants to talk with you personally, if he wants to learn more about you, where he or she should go?
Okay, my website is www.jodieforrestastrology.com. Jodie Forrest with 2 R's, astrology.com.
Mm-hmm.
And the email I use the most often has my legal, not my professional name, and that's Jodie Tighe, JODIE, TIGHE @gmail.com. And you can contact me through my website very easily. I'm also on Facebook. I have a professional page and a personal page. I'm not on Twitter as often as I'd like to be, but I am on Twitter.
Do you have Instagram too?
Yes, I'm on Instagram.
It's a mess with all this social media thing.
Yeah, I know.
I have the same problem, God. We are social media managers, not anymore astrologers. It's a hell. Thank you again. Thank you really very much. I hope the people really enjoy it, and was really happy to have with me here today.
Well, I'm delighted that you asked me, Christos. Thank you.
Well, my dear friends, bye-bye. Have a good afternoon in America. Have a good night in Greece. It's 2 a.m. here. And I hope you have a great time in all over the world. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.